Last week we talked about listening, but of course receiving information properly is only as good as you can return it. So when it comes to, I guess, bad returns, foul balls, and to use the American baseball term, there's obviously a very, very large number of ways people can do talking wrong, not just in getting their words jumbled up or failing to articulate a point, but maybe even just keeping their ideas in, I guess, a poor order, where ultimately not only is the issue that you're talking about ultimately missed, but you commit what's called a fallacy. That's a fancy internet term for just a mistake in thinking. If the thoughts are numbers, the equation is the logic. So when it comes to rhetoric, us speaking to people in a proper way, we want to make sure that we not only recognize when someone's making that mistake, but also understand it well enough for us to prevent ourselves from making that same mistake. The one that we wanted to start with, and obviously there's formal and informal fallacies, there's some that are considered more prevalent than others, but in the age of the internet, especially with the kind of discourse that we are experiencing in the world today, we wanted to start with one that you've probably been the victim of, whether you knew how to describe it in Latin or not, and that was the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem, or at the human level, is addressing or attacking the person rather than the argument. It's an informal fallacy, and when it comes to why that's a mistake, obviously we give examples of it, it's going to become relevant. But what kind of groundwork needs to be made before we even get that far?
So like you said, Sean, last week we talked about how to listen, and right now we're talking about what to listen for. So last week we were given the benefit of the doubt that rhetoric can be used, and remember, rhetoric is the art of formal speaking. So this is kind of like what me and Sean are doing right now. We are not dialoguing with you directly. We are just speaking and giving prepared thoughts that hopefully will bless you. And we're using logic and reason to help edify you in particular topics. So what you should be listening to is you should be listening to our arguments and understand that logical arguments can lead us to truth. God has designed our minds in order to understand truth, and therefore we can reason through things in a way that leads us to God's truth. Truth is not something that's malleable. Truth is not something that just exists inside of each individual's head. There is objective truth, and we can actually get there through talking. The second form of rhetoric is dialectic. That's the type of arguing or persuasion that happens in a conversation. So it's you sitting down with a buddy or something like that, and you're just talking through a particular topic. So that's what listening can do. If I want to be able to engage in dialectic or even rhetoric, listening to other speakers before I make my points known to them, I need to be attuned to what their arguments are so that I could address them properly. This is, again, why me and Sean spend so much of our time studying other religions before we address them. We want to hear clearly what they're saying before we attack them. And maybe next week we'll get into straw man, because that deals a lot with people who don't listen and just attack something that's not actually there. But at any rate, we need to also be listening not only for good arguments, but as Sean said, we do need to listen for bad arguments, because if you don't address fallacies in thinking, meaning addressing wrong ways that people are approaching a topic and assuming that they are doing this accidentally, if you're not able to address those bad forms of logic and you dialogue with the person, or again, you try to persuade someone on those false presuppositions, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get anywhere at all, right? You're not going to make it to truth. You're just going to be going in circles. In Proverbs 9, verse 7, Solomon writes, "He who corrects a scoffer gets shame for himself, and he who rebukes a wicked man only harms himself." So I need to be listening. Am I dealing with a scoffer? By the way, a scoffer is someone who looks down on something, someone who they're not really listening to what you're saying. They're just looking for ways to attack you. And the ad hominem attack is a favorite for people who engage in this type of fallacy. They aren't looking to engage. They aren't looking to understand where you're coming from. They just have already dismissed you before you've opened your mouth, because they've prejudged you. They've prejudged your argument. They scoff at you.
And what's the problem with that? If you're dealing with a bad person, does that mean that the only thing they're capable of saying are bad things?
Right. And the answer is no, right? There are bad people who could say very good and right things. And we see this in the scriptures, by the way. We have recorded for us sayings of wicked people in the Bible, and they're saying real things, true things. So a good example of this is Nebuchadnezzar. You know, if you just read the book of Daniel, you might think like, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't seem like that bad of a guy. Look him up, right? Read about Nebuchadnezzar. He was not a good guy. He was a very evil king in many ways. Yet we have part of the Bible written by him. Like literally,
chapter 4 of Daniel.
Chapter 4 of Daniel is written by this guy who's a pagan king. Kind of at the end of the chapter, he has a basic relationship with God, but not really.
It took him later in life. He was as pagan as they came and behaved accordingly. We're talking the brutalization of men, women, and children, non-combatants. We're talking about scorched earth policies and starvation and sieges, which we have direct chronicles of in the books of Jeremiah and Lamentations. It wasn't pretty.
That's right. And even more than that, we have guys who are pagan kings who never even really repented, guys like Cyrus.
Or Sennacherib.
Yeah, Sennacherib, right? We have writings and sayings and edicts from these pagan kings that reflect truth. They reflect objective truth, even though the kings themselves were in error. They were evil men. But even a broken clock gets the time right twice a day. So when you're dealing with evil people, they are correct. They are capable of making correct statements. So we cannot prejudge an argument based on where someone's coming from.
The only allowance for this kind of mindset is willingness to trust. Before you hear the argument, you need to have your guard up for untrustworthy people, because they might, even if they sound like they're telling the truth, twist a few things here and there.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the animus is off of us in understanding what the argument is, because 2 + 2 = 4, even if a bad guy says it.
That's right. And if we understand that someone who we're talking to is not trustworthy, that just means we have to look up what they're saying, you know. So, and that's very important nowadays. And we'll get to that fallacy, the appeal to authority, later. But those are all very important things to be on guard for. So you guys can do your own homework, look up these logical fallacies, and me and Sean will get to them one by one. But regarding ad hominem, what if someone uses it against you? How do you address it? So obviously we shouldn't do it, right? If I'm listening to somebody and I am trying to dialogue with them, or maybe I'm performing rhetoric, I'm giving the gospel message, I'm not just going to stand up and say, you know, all of you are wrong because you are blank. You know, you are of this persuasion, you're of this ethnicity, you're of this religion, therefore you're just totally wrong, and therefore listen to me. That is a bad way to bring people into the gospel message. You cannot just attack them in their character. You have to go after their arguments. Yet what about them is wrong? Not just you're wrong because you're this thing. What about them is incorrect? You have to address them fairly. Now, if it's directed at you, how should you respond? Well, me and Sean are going to give you 2 examples in the Bible of people who had ad hominem aimed against them. One didn't react very well to it. The other one did, because it's Jesus. So let's start with the one that didn't react too well to it, how he did react and how he probably should have reacted.
Yeah, in the book of Exodus chapter 2, we have an example of this sort of ad hominem dismissal of a legitimately good claim. And this was, of course, after the incident where Moses was feeling called to follow God's calling for his life, a legitimate thing, but in the wrong way. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster abusing a slave that was one of the fellow Hebrews that he had kinship with, and he literally just straight up murdered the guy. Now, you might say, well, that's noble, that's standing against slavery, which we take for granted as far as a ethic in the world today, but understand that the follow-up to this was interesting. Now, after this is again in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 13. It says, when he went out the second day, this is Moses, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong. So it clarifies that this is addressing the right person. There wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone made a mistake, and they were both in a tussle over it. And he says, why are you striking your companion? So the question was, why are you striking your companion? But the point was, you ought not to be treating your companion, your brother, your fellow Jew, this way. The response is ad hominem. He says in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 14, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And then his response was one of fear, not towards the Hebrews, but towards Pharaoh. So the emphasis and point is what? The argument is, I shouldn't listen to your correction of my behavior. Why? Because you're a murderer. What are the consequences of me not listening to what you did yesterday? And thus the issue was dismissed. But note, does that mean that he is now justified in abusing his brother because Moses really abused an Egyptian the day before? No, two different people, two different circumstances. Your behavior is still wrong. Right. And Moses' correction was a valid one. You shouldn't strike someone or get into a fight with someone without probable cause. And even then, there are better ways of dealing with disputes. But in the end, Moses responded in fear. This is again at the end of verse 14, and said, surely this thing is known. So overcome by his own guilt, he disengaged from the conversation instead of bringing the conversation back to what the conversation was actually about. Right. So that was his mistake. He defaulted to emotions. He allowed himself to be manipulated, rightfully so, because it meant a price was now on his head. But that was the example of the ad hominem. The Israelite that was in the wrong, that was abusing his brother, said, you, Moses, are a murderer. So what does that mean to me as who's just an abuser, who's a bully? Well, you're still a bully and I'm still a murderer, but we're talking about the bully thing. So can we do that?
And this is a very good point. I love this example for a couple reasons, because we're addressing ad hominem at this point of what if the attack or the accusation that someone is bringing against you is valid? And that's what's happening with Moses. There is a valid accusation against him. Now, in a healthy relationship, right? So if I'm dealing with my wife, for instance, and she brings up a character flaw, she's like, you did this yesterday, you did that, and it's valid. It's something that's true. Because we're in a loving relationship, and I know that the reason why she's bringing this up is there might be some personal grievance against it. You did this against me. I'm unhappy, for sure. But there's also a level of love and benevolence that she's going to aim at me. I care about you. This is a destructive behavioral pattern. I want you to change. Because of that, I can engage with her in honesty. I could say, okay, you feel like I've done this thing. Let's talk about it. And I could admit to it. I could talk through it with her. That's very important. If you're dealing with someone who wants to abuse you, and they object to you in this way. And that's what Moses realizes very quickly. This guy's not bringing this up because he cares about me. He's bringing it up as a threat that you better do what I want or I'm telling. That's what Moses inferred very quickly, and that's why he runs. If you are not getting, it's called in Latin, bona fide, right? Good faith argument, someone who cares about you, right? If you're not dealing with someone who's coming from a good faith position and they're just out to get you, they're out to attack you, they're out to malign you, slander you, bring you down in any particular way, by admitting to whatever they're bringing against you, even if it's valid, by acknowledging it and confessing it, you realize that what you've done is you've dripped blood in the water. That's why you have the Maoist struggle sessions back in China where they would force confessions out of people. Now, again, why are they forcing the confessions out of them? They're not going to forgive them. They're going to use those confessions to condemn them, to take away any social standing that they had, to slander them, to smear their reputations in front of their communities before they kill them, right? That was the point. Same
thing the Muslim Inquisitions did when they were debating about Tawheed. It was what the Spaniards picked up when the Inquisitions were founded, and on it goes. But this isn't actually rational. It's emotional manipulation rather than factually acknowledging the issue.
That's right.
And that's also the funny part, is that we can also end up flipping this on its head, and not to segue into the second topic, but understand that there's a right and a wrong way to even point this out.
Right.
Because if you adopt the nasally Harvard accent and say, well, you see, I subscribe to the Reader's Digest, and what you have committed is an ad hominem fallacy, so I will disregard what you have to say now. You just come across as
probably
a weirdo.
Not the right way to do that, yeah.
So, with that being said, understand rhetoric is also including good manners, as we talked about in our introductory session. But with that then in mind, it's addressing and recognizing the real issue and getting back to it.
And so again, if you're dealing with someone and you have reason to believe, you have good reason to believe this person is out to hurt you, right? So as a counselor, by the way, I deal with this sometimes. I deal with marriages that have gone into bad territory where there's legitimate abusive behavior happening. And this type of ad hominem attack, it's utilized to justify abuse. So you have someone who's abusing their partner, they're maybe physically, but maybe emotionally, which can be just as bad. And they're beating on their partner, again, either verbally or physically. And their partner is like, why are you doing this to me? This is wrong. And they say, well, you're so high and mighty, but the other day you yelled at our kids. Or they'll bring something like that up. At that point, you have to understand this is not a good faith argument. They're not trying to help you out. If you say, yeah, you're right, and you humble yourself and you confess to it, all that's going to lead to is more abuse. If there's someone who is out to get you and they're bringing up an accusation, even if it's a valid one, engaging with them in it is not the right move, right? So you see a lot of people in our culture today and they have their confessions, right? They said something on Twitter that may have been a little insensitive and it gets way blown out of, this person's a racist, they're a bigot. I remember last year there was that girl who was on The Bachelor. I don't even remember her name. My wife sometimes watches The Bachelor, but she was on The Bachelor. She was trying to get the attention of a black guy. And then it came out that when she was in high school, she went to an antebellum ball in the South. Right, so a ball where you wear frilly dresses and you pretend like you're in the 1800s in southern, Mississippi. Now, people dug up these photos of her and they're like, she's a bigot, because apparently the only reason why you would wear a dress like that and go to a ball like that is because you love slavery and you're white. And people started attacking her like that. And so she came out and she's like, I am so sorry for everyone that I've hurt. And she starts going into this long confession. Now, here's the thing. Was it insensitive of her to go to an antebellum ball? Maybe. I mean, there's an argumentation that it really wasn't at all because there was an antebellum culture, right? Antebellum just means before the war. There was an antebellum culture that had nothing to do with slavery. So, I mean,
you could say it's not smart because those floofy dresses don't do well in high humidity, but that's not racist.
But they're ascribing intent to her that wasn't accurate. So she could have said, and again, if it was a good faith argument, she could have said, hey, maybe I could understand why that would be harmful, like why that would hurt your feelings, that I went to a ball that is at a time period that was in slavery. Maybe you're being a little oversensitive, but hey, I could own that, and maybe people shouldn't do that kind of thing. Fine. But when you're dealing with a bunch of people that are just out to smear you, if you say, I'm sorry, you're not just apologizing to the accusation, you're also apologizing for the intent behind the accusation. Yes, the reason why I went to that ball is because I'm a racist, right? That's what you're insinuating, and you're apologizing for something you never did. So if you're in a Twitter battle or something and you're really talking to someone that doesn't like you, that hates you and is slandering you, it's very important not to engage with the ad hominem attack, because in doing so, you will just bring condemnation upon yourself, and they're going to use that to further abuse you or to punish you for what you've said. They're going to then take your response. They're going to you see what they said? You see, I told you all Christians are this way, or you just don't engage with it. That's not the right way to go about it. Now, let's talk about a false ad hominem attack, just a completely false one. So this is Jesus. Now, Jesus' response will teach us how to deal with both. So as Sean said, it's not going to do you any good to be like, well, that is an ad hominem attack and that is beneath me and I'm going to go about it. You could do that and maybe you'll win some intellectual snub points, but that's about it. You're not going to win the argument.
And understand as well, Jesus had been dealing with this for a very long time. Right. This is where it comes into a public confrontation. In the previous chapter, he is accused of saying, this is in reference to John the Baptist, he's possessed. Right. And then Jesus comes around and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, as if that's an insult. And, of course, Jesus says, well, did Isaiah prophesy about you? You can't listen to nothing.
Yeah.
Now, the chapter then continues in another situation, but with, unfortunately, the same audience. And how does the conversation go after setting up the context? He heals a man who was possessed.
Right. And so, obviously, they cannot just sweep that under the rug. Everyone sees this guy. They know him. He was possessed. Now he's not possessed. You can't sweep the miracle under the rug, but maybe you can attack the character. So again, be careful. They're not going to attack the argument. Jesus' argument is, I'm the Messiah. Here's proof. I'm doing some pretty miraculous things. And instead of engaging with it, they attack his character. Now, this is how they do it. So this is verse 23. And all the multitude were amazed and said, could this be the son of David? So people are really starting to think about it. Hey, he's claiming to be Messiah. Maybe he is Messiah.
He's proving it.
He's kind of proving it right now. The Pharisees respond. Now, when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. You see, the reason why he casts out demons is because he himself is in league with the demons. Now, that airtight, logical argument right there may sound like when you just observe it, you're like, that's really stupid, but you see what they're doing. It is an ad hominem attack. It's don't listen to this guy. He's demon possessed, right? Don't even listen to what he's saying. Don't be around him. He is in league with the demons. They are just trying to get people to not listen to Jesus, to go away from him. Now, listen to Jesus' response. Very, very insightful for us.
This is what's known as reductio ad absurdum.
So Jesus says, but Jesus knew their thoughts. He has a little bit of advantage of us towards us in that respect. But to be fair, I don't think you needed the powers of Jesus to know what was going on in that crowd. These guys lacked subtlety. They were pretty blatant in their disregard for logic. But Jesus is pretty awesome, so he actually knows what they were thinking, even if without having to observe it, and said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? And if I cast out demons by Beelzebub, by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore, they shall be your judges. But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, surely the kingdom of God has come upon you. Or how can one enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods, unless he first binds the strong man, and then he plunders his house? He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters abroad. Really amazing argumentation. Short, concise, but man, it goes for the jugular. There's a reason why after Jesus drops a bomb like this, there's no responses. It's because there really isn't a good response to that. He completely demolished their argument in less than 2 sentences in 3 different ways, and he then shows that they're the ones that are in the bad spot. So how does he do it?
What were the ways that he dealt with it?
So let's go through them one at a time. Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation. So the first thing that he does is, notice, he doesn't deny it. He's not like, I am not of Beelzebub. How dare you? Like he doesn't do that, which is what we would tend to do. Or like, how dare you accuse me of this? Look at all the miracles I'm doing. He doesn't engage on their level. He brings the conversation into a completely different perspective. He's like, let's think about your attack.
If you're right, let's pretend the smart people are smart here and say, if in fact I have performed an exorcism by Satan, is that a bad thing? Because if you're right, that means Satan's at civil war with himself, which is a good thing.
That means
and you
Satan's
don't like
done.
it.
Yeah, that means Satan's done.
But in the other stat, don't your children, your fellow Jews, also have exorcism teams, even in the Sanhedrin? Are they doing demon civil war things too? Or do you think that they're from God? And then likewise, if this is from God, like me, why don't you believe me? Even if I assume you're right, you lose.
And those are the beautiful things about the arguments that Jesus gives, where no matter how you think about it at that point, you're wrong. Right? So if you're right, you're wrong. If you're wrong, you're wrong. That's how wrong you are. And Jesus does this very, very well. Now, another thing that he points out is, because he gets him to the point where you're just wrong, but then he pushes it even further, and he says, how can one enter a strong man's house or plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? So now he's pointing back to the miracle. He's not playing their game. He's not engaging with them. He is owning the topic. He is owning the subject right now, and he's bringing it back to what he did. He's like, I'm not going to let you distract. I'm not going to let you dismiss my proof, this evidence that I am the Messiah. I am bringing the conversation back to the evidence. And think about this. If I'm just a guy, right? I've proven I'm not demon-possessed, but if I'm just a dude, how can I cast out Satan? Right? You can't bind a strong man unless, guess what? You're stronger, right? So obviously the power I'm dealing with...
And unless you're in like a fraternity or something, generally you're not on the same side as the one you're robbing.
That's right. So he's like, if I'm stronger than Satan, what does that make me, right? What does that make me? So his argument leads to people's conclusion of not only am I not demon possessed, but I am of God. And if you reject me, what does that make you, right? So that is the argumentation that Jesus uses. So let's use a modern day example and try to apply some of what Jesus is doing. So remember, don't engage directly in it. Look at their logic and question it, really pull it apart. So last week, me and Sean were giving some classes on rhetoric, and someone in the comment section mentioned that they were showing some of me and Sean's teachings, right? You say our past Reason for Hope broadcasts to one of their friends, and their friend said, well, they're just bigots, okay? Now, how would we respond to that? Because that is an ad hominem attack. They're not addressing any of our specific points. How should someone respond to that using this methodology that we get from Jesus?
Well, I can take the Moses route and basically own it entirely. Yeah. I can say, yeah, sure. What does that have to do with what we said, though? They are going to be able to use that emotional vindication in their minds to still dismiss us, even if it puts them in the wrong. We can own up to something that isn't true and live with that before the throne of God, but of course that doesn't accomplish the most possible good. So if I own it, I've basically jumped into a lesser mousetrap that isn't going to hurt me, but still is going to go off. Don't want to head that direction. Another direction I could go is just not regard the conversation's accusation in the first place. Yeah. I can ask maybe what about what we said was bigoted. We were talking about, I don't know, whether or not the passage in maybe Luke 23:11 and Matthew 27:27 is contradictory when both acknowledge the same historical fact. That's not bigotry. I can look up the definition if you'd like. I'd put the challenge on them and said, you make the claim, you provide the proof, because that's not a rational conclusion. I'll just ask, if I'm the strong man here, that is what is ultimately going to matter. If I'm opposing a lie, that doesn't make me a bigot, that makes me on the side of truth. Are you then opposing the truth? That doesn't make you a bigot, that makes you a liar. Right. You're misrepresenting or slandering us. Then I could take the double Jesus route, not acknowledge, not play into the hands of any topic, and just go right back to the issue. You say that we're a bigot. Are you irrationally dismissing the truth claim that we're making on the basis of who we are, on the basis of our skin color, our religious beliefs? What does that make you? And on it goes. But understand that this kind of rhetoric, there's your word for the day, doesn't actually end up going anywhere. So you have to judge the person. Right. So that's ultimately the options.
Bring it full circle. Proverbs 9 verse 7 says, the passage I started with, he who corrects a scoffer gets shame for himself, and he who rebukes a wicked man only harms himself. So in this public forum, Jesus, even though he knows that this is not a good faith argument, that he's not going to convince them, he engages with them anyway. Now, this is very important. His reason for engaging with them is not to convince them. He knows that they're not going to be convinced. His reason for engaging is to convince those who are listening, the audience. So sometimes people ask, well, why do Christians debate? Especially guys like, Richard Dawkins, who basically only does ad hominem attacks, or Lawrence Krauss.
Strawmans, yeah.
Also, a mixture of strawmans and ad hominems. That's kind of like their go-to. Why even debate those people? Well, sometimes you're not debating them for their sake. You're debating them maybe for those one or two people in the audience who are legitimately seeking, right? They're not fully in the atheist camp. They're not fully in the Christian camp.
They know about the atheist camp to say they sound like they know what they're talking about, but if a Christian comes up and basically debunks that myth, right, then there's a better conversation to be had in the future.
Right. And so if you're online and you're engaging with someone and it's just the vitriol that you see on social media, sometimes it's best just avoid it. But every now and then you might be like, maybe I'll engage with this person for a little bit and allow those who are engaging with this particular thread to read the arguments, right? Maybe I'm doing it for their sake. There's an argument for that for sure. But regardless, if I recognize that I am dealing with someone who cannot be reasoned with, right? They don't actually want to hear the arguments. They just want to attack. They just want to slander. They just want to go around the topic at hand. If I'm dealing with someone like that, it's what Solomon is saying is you're only going to get shame for yourself, right? There's a certain point where you got to recognize I'm not getting anywhere with this person, and continuing to engage with them is bringing me down. It's not lifting them up. So I'm going to disengage and let them be right in their own mind. What's the rule for that? I always use the Titus 3 verse 10 passage. Reject a divisive person after the first and second admonition, knowing that such a person is warped and self-condemning. Give it 2 really good tries, right? So they come at you with an ad hominem, something like that. You respond to it as well as you can, as rationally and as calmly as you can. And if you do it twice, well, and they're still just like, oh, you're just a big, you're a Christo-fascist, you don't know what I'm talking about. All right. Then you could just walk away from the conversation, and they will be right in their mind. And when they talk to their friends later, they won that conversation. That's fine.
And if you don't like that, there's an opportunity to grow past pride, because that's something we struggle with too.
That's true. All right. Any last thoughts on ad hominem?
No, just make sure that when you recognize these things, that as the wise strategist does, it doesn't appeal or focus on the cheese. It remembers this is a trap and then responds accordingly. If we understand how to talk to people and maintain good manners, then what ultimately is going to matter isn't just that we kept our logic sound in our conversation, but that God was glorified as a result of the way that we not only talk to people, but how we talk to them. Because human nature being what it is, speaking from recent experience, you get involved in any meaningless conversation for long enough, it will drag you down. It will bum you out. It will send your emotions in a tizzy, and you don't need that. But if on the other hand you have the opportunity, this is our suffering for your gain, the point then being made is this: if you are willing to say what was said, I'm willing to be accountable for, that's good enough. And if what was said is in line with God's character, the foundation of logic and reason, then God bless you. Understand that is worth answering for, rather than just saying, well, I tried to talk this person off the cliff, not realizing they were the cliff. I'm not going to change the nature of someone who's going to dismiss me before we even started. So let us know if that was all clear, and we'll look forward to our next rhetoric lesson next time.